who, for all intents and purposes, had not offended in 20 years because they were in custody, but their narrative of desistance was very similar to the men who were doing quite well in the community. So it turns out that it's complex, right? This is not a surprise. So then I was faced with this, am I talking about recidivating desisters or desisting recidivists? And this is getting ridiculous. So here are some examples just to show you the complexity of what we're dealing with. Ross, living in the community for 9 years, offence-free. He's not been in trouble since he was released. He targeted, groomed, and abused 35 children. He could remember the names of 27 of them. He was pretty sure there was more than 35, but he was confident that it was at least 35. He served 1 sentence. So when I went through my official records, he got a 1 because he served 1 sentence. But he had 35 victims that he remembers. So how do I give him points for that? Like, that's persistent, right? And chronic and prolific. But for the last 9 years, he has not offended at all, or so he tells me. Then there's Marshall. He reoffended in 1991 with a non-sexual homicide, and he's currently serving his 7th sentence, and it's currently a 25-year term. He hasn't had any disciplinary reports in 15 years, and he mentors other men in group, and he shares a very redemptive narrative of desistance. And then there's Eric, who was incarcerated for abusing both stepchildren. He then was incarcerated for that offence, returned to his family, and was re-incarcerated for offences against the same 2 children. He ended up serving a total of 38 years behind bars. He's now 78 and lives in a shelter. So it turns out it's not a coin flip, it's not dichotomous. Desistance is temporal and multifaceted, and people can succeed for a little while and then the bottom can fall out, or they can come out with the greatest of intentions and then things don't go so well, and maybe there's a situational component, and maybe there's a relationship component, and maybe there's an employment component, and all of this stuff matters, and people are complex, and I don't think I'm telling you anything that you don't already know. But this caused a bit of a problem for me, who was trying to do a research project on these guys. So basically, I interviewed 19 men in 2011. It was a sample of convenience in the community. That was in Massachusetts. The following year, I recruited 28 men in Maine, the state that's north of Mass. And then I got funding from the Guggenheim Fund. Those first 2 years were just on my dime, or 10-cent piece, I guess now I have to say. And then I got money from the Guggenheim Foundation and was able to do this in a much more targeted fashion. So then I interviewed 27 men in 2013, and these were the men who came from that particular facility at the particular time. They'd participated in the gradual release program, and 11 of them had returned to custody for a serious offence. 9 of them were sexual, and 2 of them had committed homicide that was not sexually motivated. And then 16 of those men were back in the community. So they'd all been released at around the same time in the 90s, some a little bit more recently. And they had all of the men that I interviewed in the community had not had a charge since they had been released. So total of 74, which again is too many for a qualitative thing. So I conducted individual face-to-face semi-structured interviews, and I used the life history interview protocol. Happy to give you details on that if you wish. It was suggested for use with sex offenders by Laws and Ward in their call to arms in 2011. Maruna used a similar version in 2001 for his study of men on probation, and it was originally written by McAdams. I gave the guys in the community a $25 gift card that they could use at the grocery store or drugstore of their choice, but they weren't allowed to get alcohol. And the guys in custody, the maximum I could give them was $10 according to the Department of Corrections rules. The interviews were transcribed manually, and I re-experienced them many times. I did a lot of the transcribing myself. I listened to each interview several times and coded them using narrative analysis and examined themes that emerged naturally. I did use in vivo. If anybody wants to discuss method, I'm happy to talk about that. But I also used the time-honored tradition of index cards, highlighters, and post-it notes, and blue tack. And for that, I would like to thank the restraint of my toddler. who only messed up a couple of them. Okay, so research questions. I wanted to answer the why questions because they're the more interesting ones at dinner parties, right? When you tell someone what you do. Everybody wants to know why. And it became really clear to me early on that we weren't there yet. We weren't at a stage yet in the world of desistance literature to be able to answer why questions. So I needed to back up quite a bit and do this with a beginner's mind. So when I talked about desistance, there was no point in asking why they desisted yet. It was more important to find out and to operationalize what we were talking about. So how long have they been out? How long have they not been offending? What are they desisting from? It doesn't make sense to compare somebody like Ross, who had 35 victims, with somebody like Richard, who abused his biological niece on one occasion. We needed to understand how long had passed since the offence, right? So for Jeremy, who drove his third rape victim in a fortnight period to the police so that she could report him, was caught shortly after the event. Whereas Richard, who abused his 9-year-old niece on one occasion, she was 9, she lived next door, he abused her. On one occasion, he says, then 10 years went past and he went back to living in his house, and he didn't go anywhere, right? He just continued living. He got married, he had children, he got a job, he managed all of the stakes in conformity that you're supposed to have, and then when his niece was 19 and in therapy for something completely unrelated, she happened to mention what had happened when she was 9 and gave enough information that the therapist, who was a mandated reporter, had to report it, and so he got plucked from his informal social controls and served 10 years for something that had happened, so I'm interviewing him for something that's happened 20 years ago. So how do the historical sex offences factor into this, and how can we make sense of that? And of course, the bigger question in the back of my mind through all of this is, how do we know, right? Just because you didn't get caught, just because you didn't get in trouble, just because you're telling me now versus just because somebody didn't say anything, this idea of self-report, the spectrum between self-report, arrest, charge, conviction, actually getting into custody is quite considerable. And then the definition of recidivism, something else that's plagued with problems in research. Are we talking about sexual recidivism or non-sexual recidivism? Does it count if it's exactly the same offence against the same child? Does it have to be the same offence against somebody different? What if it's escalation? How do we know? How are we classifying that? How long is the follow-up period? We know that people that commit sex offences tend to have longer plateau periods between offences, longer than, say, a burglar who might engage in offences more compulsively. So there was a lot to consider. So by the time I'd got my head around what desistance was and how I was classifying it and what they were desisting from, I realised I had to do that before I answered the why question. So here is my table on what they desisted from, right? There were a range of offence scenarios. I know I mentioned that case of the person peeing on the sidewalk or the person breastfeeding in public. Just to clarify, none of those such cases were in my sample. I wanted to focus on the pointy end of the distribution so that there was it wasn't possible to underestimate the gravity of their offences. So that's not what we're dealing with here. These are all fairly serious. There were some, as you can see, if I can work out which button to press, there we go. Some at the far end who really considered the way that they described their offences, and certainly their files clarified what they had described to me, that their offences were sort of constituted an isolated offence. It was either a single event, a single victim, or it was what I'd called relational child molestation, which just sounds awful, but basically it's somebody with a small, someone with a child, like 9 to 10 years old usually, a girl that they knew in their circle of friends, maybe it was a friend's child or a stepdaughter or something, and it happened over the period of a weekend. or it happened, at a family vacation. It happened over a very short period of time and it was isolated. And then there were the cases, quite a lot of cases where it was one victim over a long period of time. And for that, there were short-term opportunistic examples where, again, it was sort of over a weekend. And then long-term, very low functioning, where the men really believed that this person was their significant other and had that emotional congruence with children and really looked the sort of stereotypical part of somebody with diagnosable pedophilia. And then there was mixed-term, sexually motivated, again, all child victims here. Then there were the multiple victims who served one sentence. The guys in this group had a very distinct desistance narrative provided to them on a platter that was one of recovery, because these guys got to say, I've been doing this for X number of years, months, days, whatever. I hit rock bottom, I needed help, and now that you've caught me, now I can get the help that I need. So there were a couple of guys in that group who had committed spree rape, so they'd had a series of adult victims over a period of weeks or months. And then there were the abuse of known children. So for example, Ross earlier with 35 children, he only got caught once. There was only one single sentencing occasion, so his record looks like it was one event, but in our conversation, they admitted to a lot more. Then there are the guys who have the typical, it's not typical at all, the people who have who have committed sexual recidivism. So they got caught, there was rape and child molestation in that group, all of stranger children. And these guys that were in yellow are the ones who committed a sexual offence, received a custodial sentence, were released from that custodial sentence, reoffended, and again served time in custody. So they've served custody at least 2 separate occasions, some of them many more. Okay, so here I was trying to talk about desistance versus recidivism, and it turns out it's not that simple. What we also really need to uncover is this difference between persistence and recidivism, right? Because what is the difference between these guys and these guys? The impact of the criminal justice system, right? So all of these people are persistent, but these guys are the ones who were persistent after the intervention of the criminal justice system. So that's a lingering question for a future post-it note, but anyway. So then what strategies, how am I going for time? Does it? Fabulous, okay. So results, what did they desist from, and now what strategies did they use? Again, I really hesitate to say that this is an answer to the why question because I don't think we're there yet. I also feel like why isn't particularly useful. What I can tell you is how they desisted and what strategies they used. So regardless of the why, and the why is going to be different for everybody, I can tell you the things that on the ground that worked under what circumstances. So I've introduced these 3 main strategies of desistance. My husband has 42 different editions of the dictionary, including one that is 21 volumes. And I had a lot of fun with it while I was trying to come up with these names. So there are the strategies of retirement, regulation, and recovery. Quite simply, those who retire either resign, they just stop, or they stop and there's some evidence of rebuilding. The guys in the recovery group, in the green, are the ones for whom we see a real narrative of rehabilitation. They either share that rehabilitative narrative that they needed or they wanted help and they knew that they could get it and they got it and now they're better, or there was more of an individual agency and sense of resilience. The guys in the middle, it looks like that's the bigger group, and it actually is. There are 4 subsections there: restricted, reclusive, resistant, and rehearsed. And the guys in the middle here are much more focused on the present. So I'll just give you some examples of each of these. The guys who retired, whether they talked about having resigned or having begun to rebuild had basically just stopped. So those of you that are familiar with the criminological theories of Maruna and knifing off and Gottfredson and Hershey and aging out, these are the guys that describe themselves as having lived two lives. They were young. There was a lot of substance abuse in this group. They were very versatile in their criminal history. They'd done a little bit of everything over a long period of time. They rejected the label of sex offender, which was quite interesting to me. And some had the social capital that allowed them to begin to rebuild. But generally speaking, this was the smallest group, and they've all been in treatment for a number of years or months, and they're all told that they have to identify certain things on a chart and be able to talk about their masturbatory reconditioning or talk about their cycle or whatever, and they just sit there and go, it just doesn't make sense. This is not who I am. It was either it was one time, or I was really drunk and I had burgled 7 houses that night. Why aren't I going to a special burglary group? Why, like, I'm just a regular dick. Sorry. But I'm just, bad choice. I'm just a regular naughty person, and I do little bits of everything, and I don't understand why we keep focusing on this one time when this particular thing happened. So they very carefully use the past tense in a lot of their interviews. The aspect markers in their language I found really interesting. The guys who retired were over it. It was in the past. It was so long ago. And the ironic thing is that it wasn't that long ago, because the guys who described themselves as having been over it and the guys who I considered had retired were actually the youngest. Right? So we know this age crime curve that you're going to age out as you get older. The guys who talked about aging out and saying things like, I'm just sick and tired of being sick and tired, they were the ones that were in their early 40s. And then the recovery guys, there was a slightly larger group of them, they were the ones who were focused on the future. Some of them were young, some of them were much older, some of them had been in custody for weeks, some of them had been in custody for years. They were the ones that told me that therapy worked. They were very high functioning. They often had family or a job before they went to custody. That all of that had disintegrated upon the discovery of their offence. But they also had impressive social capital. They operated as mentors, so consistent with Maruna's idea of the wounded healer or the desistance missionary. They were the ones who volunteered to stay on and help out the other people in the group. And some of them talked a little bit about the hope for redemption, although, while some of them had hoped for it, none of them achieved it. And really interestingly, I think some of these guys really embraced the label. It was almost as if it gave them something to geek out about. So they could embrace the I'm a sex offender, not because it's awesome, but because this gives me a way of understanding my identity and I can overcome it and I'm more than my label, and this is a way of me understanding where I came from and why I did what I did. And it was quite a transformational thing for them to talk about themselves as being in recovery. As you'll see, that was not typical. So there's the guys in the blue, the retirement guys who just stopped. It was in the past. The guys in the recovery group were able to talk about the future. One of the questions I asked routinely was, what do you look forward to? What are you afraid of? What do you hope for the future? Most of the guys would say, I just don't want to go back to jail. I just want to get through today. I hope nothing happens that puts me back in jail. The guys in this recovery group really stood out because they were the ones who said things like, I'd like to travel. I'd like to get off probation and be allowed out of this state. I would like to take a class in basket weaving. I would like to do something beyond what I'm doing right now. The guys in the regulate group, and I saved them for last because there is so much going on there, they were the ones who were very focused on the present, and not like in a totally healthy, mindful way, in a very restricted sort of, I've got blinders on, head down, this is my life now, it's all about now. They were hypervigilant, they were really struggling. This is where a lot of the men in the group were low functioning. The only time I saw any suicidal ideation or history of suicide attempts was in this group. They were paralyzed by the legislation. They had experienced great loss. Whether they had had wonderful jobs and strong families beforehand, they sure as hell didn't have it now. They had no social capital. They were loners. Some of them had a superficial grasp of therapy buzzwords, but there was no escape for them. They were going to be in this state forever. So if you see on this slide beforehand, I said there was the restricted guys. They were the ones who felt particularly restricted by the legislation. There were the reclusive guys who decided that the only way for them to live an offense-free life was just to lock themselves up, live in my cabin. I don't want to go outside. I never want to come across another human being, not because I might rape them, but just because I am convinced that everybody knows who I am, because my face is on the internet, I'm on the registry, and the cops know, and everybody knows, and I just want to stay in my room. I only leave the house to go grocery shopping, and I go at 5 a.m. so that I know that I won't come in contact with any kids, because if I'm in the same place as a kid and some shit goes down, I'm the first person that's going to get in trouble for it, regardless of whether or not they do it. There's the resistant guys. There was only a couple of those who were still in that sort of regulated, got to think about this every day, but they also thought that the whole system was shit and that they didn't deserve to be, sucked up into this. And then the rehearsed guys, that's what I'm talking about with the superficial grasp of therapy. So the rehearsed guys were able to tell me about their offending cycle, and they could tell me about their seemingly unimportant decisions, and they could tell me about how they masturbated and blah, 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 and would go into a lot of detail, sometimes too much. And and they were the ones that, that they could use the buzzwords, and they could go on a long explanation about cognitive distortions. But then when I would look through the transcripts or just ask them a simple question about how their day was going, the response was monosyllabic. So that they weren't particularly bright or engaged in any other part of their existence. But this gave them something that they could talk about like they understood something. It reminds me a little bit of the Good Lives, the primary human good that's identified in the Good Lives model about a thirst for knowledge. There were a lot of guys in this group, in the rehearse group, and then in the rehabilitate group, where I think had they had the opportunity, they might have been a very good student. Had they ever been given something to read about something that they knew about, they could have been a really good student, because this was something that they could sort of, I haven't found a better way than to say geek out. Anyway, so here are the three groups, and now I'm going to go through each one in a little bit more detail and share some of the actual quotes from the guys, just to give you a bit more of a picture. So the retire guys, those that just stopped. I'm not like I used to be. I don't get violent. I don't drink and do drugs today. I don't let the little things get to me like I used to. I have two lives. I have the life before and the life since I got out of prison. The life that I'm living now is the only time as an adult I've lived without going out and acting on my sexual deviancy. So it's as if I finally have a life. The guys who had retired equally, they just stopped, and it was that simple, but they had the social capital to rebuild, shared these stories. Right now, my life is at the height. I reopened my own business. I'm doing really, really good. I bought a house. I'm engaged to be married. I got a truck that's paid for. I got a Corvette that's paid for. I got a pool in my backyard. I'm actually doing better now than my own brothers. This guy was very interested in having me visit to see his pool. I politely declined. Something that I don't know enough about, because I'm not a psychologist, is the extent to which some of this could be the coping mechanisms that we see that overlap with psychopathic traits. So there were a couple of guys, I just want to put it out there, there were a couple of guys who appeared to be doing extremely well, and they were the ones that would wear a suit to the interview and, gave the